Welcome to Relation Tales. Please like this video and subscribe Relation Tales. It was a typical summer Friday evening, and Mark Evans was at home alone, nursing a cold bottle of craft beer as he watched the game on TV. The room was filled with the soft hum of the television and the occasional cheers or groans from Mark, a devoted baseball fan. His dog, Rufus, dozed nearby, stretching out on the rug with a low, contented growl whenever Mark's excitement disturbed his slumber. His wife, Sophie, was at their neighbor Lila's house, catching up after a long week. Mark loved these peaceful, unhurried evenings where life felt simple and fulfilling. He'd married Sophie 20 years ago after meeting her in college. She had always been the dazzling one, charismatic, sharp-witted, and effortlessly charming. Even now, at 42, Sophie was striking, turning heads in almost every room she entered. While Mark had always seen himself as an ordinary man, with an average build and laid-back style, he took pride in his loyalty and devotion to his family. So when Sophie came home that evening, sitting him down with a solemn expression he had rarely seen, Mark's heart raced with a strange, unspoken dread. "Mark," she began softly, settling herself on the edge of the couch, her posture stiff and anxious. She looked up at him with a complex blend of fear and determination. "Can we talk about something personal?" Mark muted the TV and turned to face her, his mind flickering through possibilities. Had someone passed away? Was she ill? But then she took a deep breath and dropped a bombshell he never saw coming. I want to be with someone else," Sophie murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes darted away from his gaze, but Mark could see the redness around her eyes, the hesitation in her trembling hands. For a moment, the room was silent, and Mark sat motionless, his mind reeling to process the words. His stomach twisted as anger, shock, and disbelief surged through him in waves. "Sophie, what are you talking about?" he managed, his voice low, almost pleading. He searched her face, hoping for some sign that she was joking, that this was just an awful attempt at humor. But Sophie's gaze didn't waver. "Mark, I just need to feel something different. I need to feel wanted by someone new. I'm not saying I don't love you. It's just, I want one night, just one night to experience someone else." Mark shot up from his chair, his face flushed with fury and betrayal. "Absolutely not," he snapped, pacing the room, his mind racing. "I can't believe you're even asking me this." Mark's mind flew back to memories of their early years. They'd met as juniors at Northwestern University. He was studying computer science and she was majoring in finance. Mark had been captivated by her vivacious spirit. Sophie was the type of person who commanded attention effortlessly. While he was a quiet, grounded type, Sophie had been popular, confident, and seemingly out of his league. Their connection had felt almost magical at the time, and Mark always considered himself lucky to have won her heart. He remembered their late nights spent talking under the stars, Sophie sharing her dreams of success, travel, and experiences. In contrast, Mark had always been content with a more humble, steady life. They balanced each other out, or so he thought. The early years of their marriage had been wonderful, filled with laughter and dreams of building a future together. But as time passed, Sophie's zest for life turned into a restless dissatisfaction. Mark had noticed it. In the subtle way her laughter became rarer, her late nights texting with friends becoming more frequent. For Sophie, life felt like it was slipping away too fast. After years of marriage, she was struggling with her identity. The once promising finance career had become mundane, a far cry from her aspirations. She felt unseen, undervalued, even though Mark remained a devoted husband. To him, she was the center of his world. But Sophie needed more. She needed to feel excitement, the thrill of the unknown, something Mark, reliable and familiar, could no longer provide. In her office, David Clark, a handsome new manager with piercing blue eyes and a disarming charm, seemed to notice Sophie in a way that Mark hadn't in years. David was attentive, giving her that flirtatious smile that made her feel young and alive again. It started as harmless small talk at first, an extended glance here, a quick lunch there. But soon, David's compliments and lingering touches began to mean more to her than she wanted to admit. Sophie knew the risks, But the thought of feeling desired, admired, and even worshipped was intoxicating. It filled a void she didn't realize had grown so wide. But she had never meant to ask Mark for his permission. The impulse was a mix of fear, desire, and selfishness. When Mark reacted with such pain, she felt the weight of her betrayal pressing on her. But the longing in her heart was stronger. Mark spent the next few days in a haze of confusion and hurt. He tried to focus on work, drowning himself in projects, hoping that the pain would subside. But the words Sophie had spoken kept haunting him. He noticed the distance that had been growing between them, the way she seemed absent even when she was right next to him. One evening, he confided in his best friend, Jake, who had been a pillar of support through every phase of Mark's life. Over beers, Mark let it all spill out, every painful detail. "You can't let her do this to you, Mark," Jake said firmly, his face twisted in anger on behalf of his friend. "If she's already thinking about someone else, who's to say she won't do it behind your back? This isn't something that just goes away." Mark realized Jake was right. If Sophie had gone as far as asking him for this, her loyalty was already fractured. He felt a rising anger, not just at Sophie, but at the realization that she may have already emotionally left him. The thought gnawed at him, keeping him up at night. In the weeks that followed, Sophie continued to see David, her actions becoming increasingly bold. She would stay out later than usual, claiming that her friend Lila needed her company more and more. Mark started noticing the lies, how she would tense up when her phone buzzed, the quick, furtive glances she would give the screen, and her over-elaborate explanations that seemed too perfect to be true. One night, Mark decided to check Sophie's phone after she fell asleep. What he found confirmed his worst suspicions. Long text threads with David, filled with playful teasing, flirty remarks, and hints of intimate plans. His heart broke as he read the words, feeling betrayed by the woman he had loved for so many years. The day after Mark discovered Sophie's text with David, he knew he couldn't continue living in denial. Her words, her laughter, her intimate thoughts, things he once believed were theirs alone, were now shared with another man. Mark wasn't just angry. He felt betrayed and humiliated. But rather than confronting her in a rage, he decided to take a different approach. Mark needed time to think, to plan, and most importantly, to protect himself and his children from the fallout he knew would come. The idea of a direct confrontation felt weak, and he didn't want to just walk away and leave Sophie to move on without consequences. She had started down this path, and he would make sure she knew exactly what she was giving up. Mark took the first step by reaching out to his lawyer, Mason Rivera, who specialized in family law. Mason listened patiently as Mark explained the situation, his voice tense and controlled, his words laced with the pain of a man who'd lost everything he held dear. "You're doing the right thing by coming to me," Mason said, his tone professional but sympathetic. "And there are ways to handle this that will leave you in a much better position when the dust settles. But first things first, don't let her know you're aware of the affair. Not yet. Gather evidence, keep calm, and focus on what matters." With Mason's advice, Mark began documenting everything: messages he'd found, Sophie's late-night outings, her unexplained absences. He noted how her demeanor had shifted, from attentive and sweet to distant and cold. Mark realized now that these subtle changes had been signs of her shifting loyalty. As he prepared himself emotionally for the divorce, Mark grew more determined to protect his family and reputation. His friends and family, especially his children, needed to see Sophie's betrayal for what it was, and he would find a way to expose the truth. Meanwhile, Sophie was blissfully unaware of Mark's suspicions. Her new relationship with David filled her with a sense of liberation she hadn't felt in years. She felt young, vibrant, and desired. Every lunch with David, every coffee shared, every secret smile exchanged thrilled her. She found herself sneaking away during the day to check her phone for his messages, laughing at his clever comments and soaking up his compliments. David, however, had his own secrets. Although he charmed Sophie with his wit and flattery, he was not as invested as she thought. The affair was exciting, sure, but David was pragmatic. He had no intention of letting it disrupt his career or engagement, especially with his wealthy fiancée, Emily. For him, Sophie was just a thrilling escape from his everyday routine, a bit of harmless fun. One evening, David canceled their plans at the last minute, citing a work emergency. Sophie was crushed, disappointed not only by his sudden unavailability, but by the realization that she wasn't his priority. For the first time, she felt a pang of guilt, remembering how Mark had always made her his number one. But she shook off the guilt, convincing herself that she deserved this, that it was just a phase she needed to go through. Mark knew Sophie's weakness, her reputation. Sophie prided herself on the image she'd built over the years, a loving wife, a doting mother, and a respected professional. Mark decided that rather than lashing out, he would let her watch her carefully constructed world crumble around her. He reached out to their mutual friends, subtly hinting at issues in their marriage without revealing too much. "I don't know what's happened to us," he confided quietly to friends like Ryan and Lila, painting himself as a patient and faithful husband who had done everything he could to keep his marriage together. Lila, Sophie's close friend, seemed especially taken aback, torn between loyalty to her friend and sympathy for Mark. Over the next few weeks, whispers started spreading among their friends. Lila, a known confidant of Sophie's, tried to gently confront her about the rumors, but Sophie brushed her off, insisting everything was fine. Yet, as her friends grew distant, Sophie began to feel the isolation creeping in. One afternoon at work, Sophie noticed people exchanging glances and heard whispers that stopped whenever she entered a room. A few of her colleagues, who had once admired her, seemed colder, avoiding eye contact or limiting conversations to polite nods. She wondered if they knew about David, if somehow her secret had slipped out. The pressure began to weigh on her, making her relationship with David feel less like an adventure and more like a looming threat. David, too, started to pull away. One day, Sophie noticed his demeanor had shifted. He seemed less attentive, his texts becoming curt and his lunches hurried. Sophie finally confronted him, asking if something was wrong, but David brushed it off, reassuring her that everything was fine. But Sophie felt the distance. In truth, David's fiancée, Emily, had noticed something off about his behavior and questioned him. Pressed to choose between a casual affair and his future, David decided to cut ties with Sophie, reducing her to little more than a memory. As David's interest faded, Sophie felt the coldness of being discarded, a sensation she hadn't experienced since her youth. But it was more than just David's rejection that stung. It was the slow realization of what she'd risked for a fleeting thrill. At home, Mark continued to act oblivious, watching Sophie dig herself deeper into her own guilt. But one evening, he finally broke his silence. He waited for Sophie to come home, his expression controlled, yet brimming with a calm intensity that she hadn't seen before. "Sophie, we need to talk," he said quietly, gesturing for her to sit down. She looked startled but complied, sensing the seriousness in his tone. Mark looked directly into her eyes, his voice steady but laced with hurt. "I know about David. I've known for weeks, Sophie." Her face drained of color, her hands trembling. "Mark, I didn't—" "You didn't what?" Mark's voice hardened. "Didn't betray me? Didn't lie to me? I've seen everything, Sophie. I know about the texts, the nights you said you were with Lila, the stolen glances." Sophie's words caught in her throat, her defenses crumbling. She reached for him, but he pulled back, his expression one of absolute resolve. "Sophie, I trusted you. I built a life with you, shared everything with you. And this is how you repay me? I could have forgiven anything else, but you chose someone else over your family." Tears streamed down Sophie's face as she realized the depth of her mistake. She had taken Mark's love for granted, never believing he would stand up for himself, assuming he'd always forgive her. But the Mark sitting before her now was a stranger, a man who had reached his limit. The fallout was swift and unforgiving. Mark filed for divorce, and the news quickly spread among their friends and family. Sophie's once gleaming reputation was tarnished, with whispers of infidelity following her everywhere. Mark's calm, steady demeanor won him sympathy from all sides, painting Sophie as the villain who had shattered their once happy family. Mark found solace in the support of friends like Jake, who encouraged him to move on and leave the past behind. Over time, he began to rediscover his independence, feeling liberated from the hurt and betrayal that had once consumed him. Sophie, on the other hand, struggled to rebuild her life. Her relationship with David had ended, her friends kept their distance, and her children, who had once looked up to her, found it hard to forgive her. She had gambled everything for a thrill, and now she was left with nothing but regret. Months after the divorce, Mark met Anna, a compassionate woman with a similar past. They bonded over shared experiences, finding solace in each other's company. Unlike Sophie, Anna understood the value of loyalty and trust, and over time, she helped Mark heal from the wounds Sophie had left behind. For the first time in years, Mark felt truly at peace. He had weathered the storm of betrayal and emerged stronger, his resilience carrying him through. With Anna by his side, Mark began to see that love wasn't about excitement and fleeting passion, but about understanding, respect, and unwavering support. In the end, Sophie's betrayal had given Mark a gift, a newfound strength and the wisdom to recognize genuine love when he found it. And as he moved forward, he carried with him the lessons of his past, ready to build a new life grounded in the values he held dear. With the divorce finalized, Mark settled into a modest two-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. It was quiet, far too quiet compared to the family home he'd share with Sophie and the kids. At first, the silence felt hollow, a constant reminder of all he'd lost. But as the days passed, he began to see the peace in his new solitude, a space where he could process everything without feeling trapped by memories. He set up a small workspace in the spare bedroom, immersing himself in projects and work. There were late nights where he'd lose himself in coding, relishing the clarity it gave him. But even with the distraction, the pain lingered. He missed his children and the feeling of completeness their presence had brought. One weekend, his son, Josh, came to stay with him. Mark seized the opportunity to share his thoughts and advice on relationships. Sitting on the small couch with their takeout containers and soda cans, Mark tried to convey the importance of loyalty, trust, and respect. "Josh, I know it's hard to understand why things fell apart," Mark began, choosing his words carefully. "But I want you to know that marriage, relationships, they only work when both people are committed to each other fully. And once that trust is broken, it's hard to rebuild." Josh nodded solemnly, absorbing his father's words. He had his own relationship, and Mark hoped his son would remember this advice. After a pause, Josh placed a hand on Mark's shoulder, surprising him with a gesture. "You didn't deserve what happened, Dad," he said softly. "I know that now." The simple words touched Mark deeply, reassuring him that he hadn't failed completely, that even in the face of betrayal, he could still be a good father. Sophie, meanwhile, was finding the post-divorce reality far from the fantasy she'd once dreamed of. Her fling with David had long since ended, and he'd moved on quickly, securing his engagement with Emily and relocating to another city. Sophie felt trapped, isolated, and lonely in ways she hadn't anticipated. She thought her friends would support her, that they would understand, but most of them kept their distance, uncomfortable with her choices and the consequences. At work, the judgment was silent but unmistakable. Colleagues no longer looked at her with admiration, but rather with polite indifference, and her former friend, Lila, seemed to avoid her altogether. Sophie tried to rekindle their friendship, but Lila's loyalty to Mark made her hesitant. Sophie had once thought that leaving the marriage was a path to freedom. But now, facing empty weekends and strained relationships with her children, she realized that she had lost far more than she had gained. Months after the divorce, Mark decided to venture back into the world of dating, albeit cautiously. He knew he wasn't looking for anything serious, but he needed to feel human again, to experience companionship beyond his work and the occasional weekend visit from Josh. At the suggestion of his friend Jake, Mark agreed to meet Anna, a woman Jake's wife knew from her work in social services. They met at a quiet cafe, and as they sipped their coffee, Mark found himself unexpectedly at ease with her. Anna had a calm demeanor, a warmth that made Mark feel understood. As they talked, Mark learned that Anna had her own painful history. Her ex-husband had betrayed her in a different way, abandoning her emotionally and eventually leaving her for someone else. She understood the wounds of betrayal, the trust issues, and the skepticism toward relationships that often lingered. They ended up meeting a few more times, their connection growing with each conversation. She offered insights that Mark found comforting, making him feel less alone in his experience. One evening, while walking along the lake after dinner, Anna paused, looking out over the water, her expression contemplative. "You know, I used to think that love was about grand gestures," she said softly. "But after everything that happened, I've realized it's the small things, the quiet, unspoken understanding and respect that matter the most." Mark nodded, feeling a weight lift from him. Her words resonated deeply, affirming what he had come to learn in the months since his marriage ended. "Yeah, I get that now," he replied, smiling. "I spent so long trying to prove my love with grand gestures, and I missed the quiet, simple things that build a foundation. Funny how clear it all seems now." One afternoon, Sophie called Mark, asking if they could meet. Hesitant but curious, Mark agreed. They met at a small park near their old neighborhood, sitting on a bench beneath the shade of an oak tree. Sophie looked older, worn down by the months of regret and loneliness. She didn't carry the same confident air Mark had known for years. Instead, she looked humble, almost fragile. "Mark, I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she began, her voice trembling. "I know words can't undo what I did, but I need you to know that I realize now what I lost." Mark listened quietly, letting her speak without interruption. "I was so selfish," Sophie continued, tears welling up in her eyes. "I thought I needed something more, something exciting. But I was wrong. You gave me everything I could have ever wanted, and I took it for granted." Mark's gaze was steady, compassionate, yet distant. He felt a pang of sadness, but no longer the raw pain that had once consumed him. "I appreciate your apology, Sophie," he replied, his tone calm. "But I can't forget what happened. I can forgive, yes, for my own peace. But things can never go back to the way they were." Sophie nodded, her shoulders slumping. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that he would take her back, that somehow they could rebuild what they had once shared. But seeing his resolve, she understood that she had lost him forever. As they parted ways, Mark felt a sense of closure wash over him. Sophie's apology didn't erase the betrayal, but it allowed him to finally release the bitterness he'd carried for so long. With the apology behind him, Mark felt ready to move on fully. His connection with Anna deepened, and they began spending weekends together, sharing quiet dinners and laughter-filled conversations. She understood his need for patience, never pushing him for more than he was ready to give. For Mark, it was a refreshing change, a relationship built on mutual respect and genuine care. He introduced Anna to his children, and though they were initially hesitant, they warmed to her kindness and authenticity. Josh, in particular, was relieved to see his father happy again, and he appreciated Anna's understanding nature. Over time, Mark and Anna built a life together, one based on trust and honesty, where neither felt the need to prove themselves. It was a love that grew slowly, like a garden tended with care, blossoming in its own time. Years later, on the anniversary of his divorce, Mark found himself looking back, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of the pain, the betrayal, and the anger, but he also saw the resilience that had carried him through. His relationship with Anna had blossomed into a quiet but profound love, one that brought him a peace he hadn't known was possible. He no longer saw Sophie's betrayal as the end of his happiness, but rather as the beginning of a new chapter that had led him to where he was meant to be. As he stood in his kitchen, watching Anna prepare dinner, he felt a sense of gratitude. He had learned, healed, and grown, and he was ready to embrace the future with open arms, knowing that he was finally where he belonged. Mark lifted his glass, toasting to new beginnings, to love that lasts, and to the strength that had guided him through. And for the first time in years, he felt complete. Mark never forgot the lessons he'd learned through his journey. His story became a reminder to his children and friends of the importance of loyalty, trust, and integrity. He shared his insights freely, helping others see that sometimes what seems like the end is only the beginning. He often reflected on the words Anna had shared with him on that lakeside walk. That love wasn't about grand gestures, but about the quiet, consistent moments of care and respect. that he realized was what made a marriage or a relationship truly strong. And it was what he carried forward in his heart every day.